Hello, and welcome to today's session on the Introduction to Ethics in Research. Please remember that before we get started, you should have your PowerPoint lecture notes printed and in front of you. This way you can take notes as we're proceeding through the PowerPoint presentation, and you should bring those notes to class so that we have a very involved discussion. Your class participation is very important, and we want to make sure that you're well prepared for our session in class. So please stop the video now if you haven't already done that. For those of you who are ready to go, let's jump right in and talk a little bit about ethics in research. Okay, so the ethical issues that we experience in psychology are issues that have been addressed in many ways by the American Psychological Association, or APA, and the American Psychological Association requires that all research is approved by the host institution. So whether you're at a hospital or at a university, if you want to do ethical research, the research must first be written up in the form of a proposal and then put forth into a group that we typically call the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board. Here's a note or two about an Institutional Review Board. The Institutional Review Board typically consists of many different folks who represent many different kinds of interests that a society might have. So for example, it might be the case that several of the people on the IRB, as we call it, are themselves researchers. And in particular, if this is a psychological research report that is being reviewed, we typically will have some professional psychologists on the IRB. Additionally, we'd like to have some community members on a given IRB, so that it might be the case that people from that same geographic area, maybe even that town, are involved and are there to represent their community on the IRB. In a college setting, we frequently will have students participate in the IRB, and sometimes faculty members from, say, outside of the psychology department, so that we get a nice broad representation, and this allows us to see ethical issues from many angles. Typically, we use an institutional review board whenever the research that's being proposed is for human participants. If we are instead going to be using non-human animals, then we typically use something called an IACUC, is how it's frequently pronounced, sometimes IACUC. Either of those pronunciations you will hear. This is the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, and there are rules by which all IACUCs must function. Some of these rules come to us from agencies like the federal government. There will be stipulations about what kinds of housing must be provided to animals of different varieties. For example, it might be the case that invertebrate animals require less housing material, or rather the housing requirements are less stringent for invertebrates than they might be for vertebrates. If you go to vertebrates, then maybe there are going to be some issues relating to how rooms are ventilated and so forth, how frequently the facilities are cleaned. Within vertebrates, if you go to mammals, you might have yet another set of stringent requirements, and if you go all the way up to primates, as you might imagine, the requirements become very stringent. So whatever level of animal you might be working with, whatever particular species of animal, all of that research must be approved first by the IACUC if you're using non-human animals, and the IRB if you're using human animals. Okay, let's go a little bit further and talk about something that the IRB would be looking for, the Institutional Review Board. On your proposed research, it would be the case that the IRB is going to be asking for many things, including a written statement about the risk-benefit ratio. Okay, so both the risks and the benefits must be written out. And basically the ethical question here that the IRB will be asking is a very simple question. Is it worth it? We're going to be asking participants, either human or non-human, to be involved in this study. And usually that will involve at least some of the participants' time, but also it might entail that there's some stress that is imposed on the participant. There might be an issue of deceit. Sometimes a psychology experiment does require that we deceive the participants, at least momentarily. So there are some very clear costs. Even for a seemingly innocent study, there are often some costs. So it becomes the burden of the researcher, or the researchers plural, to explain why it is that we should undergo these costs and what kinds of benefits might we seek to find. So one way of approaching that is you can talk really about two different levels of benefit. One idea would be that you can refer to basic research. When we talk about basic research, we're talking about knowledge for knowledge's sake. And so frequently when we have a psychology experiment, maybe we're trying to understand fundamental processes of some psychological phenomena, and we would call that basic research. Even though nobody will directly benefit in the foreseeable future from this research, it might expand our knowledge base. And that would be a plausible benefit for you as a new scientist to put forth in your IRB form. In addition to basic research, there's also the possibility of applied research, and you could make recourse to the benefits to applied research. So you might, for example, be talking about such things as depression, or such things as OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or some of the more simple phobias that psychology students might experience or other college students might experience in their day-to-day lives. If you have some reason to believe that your research could offer some benefit on these important psychological topics, then you should put that into your risk and benefit ratio on the statement that you offer to the IRB. Okay, here's a potential pop quiz question for you to think about. What is meant by the concept of minimal risk? So it seems like that's a self-explanatory term, but actually in psychology, and according to the APA, we have a relatively precise definition for minimal risk. So why don't you stop the video now and jot down your answer to that question. Okay, welcome back. What we'll do now is, back in class, we'll have some conversation about your definition of minimal risk, and then we'll go ahead and do a little bit of in-class exercise. But I'll go through these exercises with you now, and even encourage you to respond to these exercises as we do them one by one. Each of these is related to the concept of minimal risk. So I'm going to read to you a brief scenario. It may or may not be the case that you can read this out here on the video. Maybe the font is too small, and I apologize for that if it is. It may also be the case that you can't quite read it on your printout, although I hope you can read it on your printout. But I'll read this to you, and the question is whether this is minimal risk or not, as a scenario. And then the question is, if yes, it is minimal risk, we'll make it a little bit more risky. How would we alter this, hypothetically, to make it more risky? And then if it's not minimal risk, then we might rewrite it so that it is minimal risk. It would become, in fact, acceptable to an IRB. Okay, so here we go. First scenario, college students are asked to complete an adjective checklist describing their current mood. The researcher is seeking to identify students who are depressed so that they can be included in a study examining cognitive deficits associated with depression. Okay? So the first question is this scenario, as described here, minimal risk? Okay? You can take a moment to jot that down. If yes, let's rewrite it to make it risky, and we'll make it such that it doesn't satisfy the minimal risk requirement. And then finally, if no, let's rewrite it to make it a little bit more risky. Okay? Or excuse me, to make it in accordance with minimal risk. You can stop the video now. Okay, welcome back. And we'll go on to our next scenario. Here's the scenario. Elderly adults in a nursing home are given a battery of achievement tests in a day room at their home. A psychologist seeks to determine if there is a decline in mental functioning with advancing age. Is this minimal risk? Okay. And then here's what we do if yes and if no, just like in the last exercise. We'll let you stop the video and proceed. Okay, welcome back. We're going on to our third minimal risk scenario. I'll read it to you, and we'll see what kinds of responses you can get. Students in a psychology research methods class, like the one you're taking now, see another student enter their classroom in the middle of the class period, speak out loudly and angrily with the instructor, and then leave. As part of a study of eyewitness testimony, the students are then asked to describe the intruder. Is this minimal risk? Okay. And then here are your yes and no responsibilities. We'll let you stop the video, and we'll see you in just a moment. Okay, and now we're up to our fourth minimal risk scenario. Welcome back. A researcher recruits students from introductory psychology classes to participate in a study of the effects of alcohol on cognitive functioning. The experiment requires that some students drink 2 ounces of alcohol mixed with orange juice before performing a computer game. Is this minimal risk? Okay? We'll let you respond to that and also answer your yes and no options down here. Okay, welcome back. And we'll move on to a new idea. Here we have another potential pop quiz question. What ethical point was raised about untreated syphilis? And here's a diagram to help jog your memory just a little bit. There's an important ethical issue and an important ethical principle that's being raised by this question and by this picture. We'll let you stop the video and see if you can respond to that. Okay, we'll welcome you back. And this is a picture of President Bill Clinton. And as you might be aware of, on the issue of the syphilis experiments that had been conducted in the 1930s and 1940s and so forth, there were some important breaches of ethics for which President Clinton very kindly and very sincerely apologized many years later. He himself did not conduct these experiments, obviously, but on behalf of the US government, he offered an apology to the offended society. And many people think that was an important move for him to make. We might call this type of apology that comes from the President of the United States apologizing on behalf of the US government. We might call this an institutional apology. And so I'm interested in your comments on the idea of institutional apologies. Here we have the case of the US government apologizing for its past actions. But you can imagine that there could be corporations or perhaps nonprofit organizations that also would be inclined to apologize for their past behavior. I'm interested in your comments on that, and we'll have that as a good class discussion. For now, let's move on. And we'll talk a little bit about this issue. Here's our old friend Uncle Sam. And in years gone by, in past decades, this sign was to indicate that young men had a responsibility to participate in the draft, the military draft. Here, what we're using the sign for is to remind us that you as a researcher have responsibilities, but research participants also have ethical responsibilities as well. It's not the case that a research participant is completely free of any kind of ethical obligation. Okay, so it's not just the researchers that have ethical obligations. So let's take a specific example. Let's say that you're a student who is in Psych 100 or whatever your introductory psych course might be, and you're participating now in some kind of psychology study that's sponsored by your university. You too have some ethical responsibilities. A couple of those would include very simple matters of showing up on time, and even though you're free to leave at any particular point in time, we would expect that you show up on time and that while you're participating, you're giving an earnest effort. If it is the case that you are participating without really attempting to complete the study to the best of your ability, if that's what's asked of you, then we can consider that to be a breach of ethics. Typically, we don't have a lot of recourse against our participants. We can't punish them in any particular way. But what we can do is this. The researchers can ethically establish data exclusion criteria. And what we mean by that is if it becomes obvious that somebody is responding, for example, to a survey very randomly, okay? Or they're responding to some kind of computer test in only a random manner, and they're not taking the test very seriously, we have the ethical right, and some people would argue the ethical obligation, to exclude those data from our analysis. And let's just see if we can understand why that might be the case. Why might it be the case that we would want to exclude those data? In science, as we've talked about before, we can make typically two kinds of errors in our studies. We can falsely conclude that there was no effect of our independent variable, or we can falsely conclude that there is an effect of our independent variable. So those would be false negatives and false positives. If we have people in our study who are unintentionally responding randomly, or even intentionally responding randomly, you can imagine that that throws off the legitimacy of your experiment. Okay? As I mentioned a moment ago, we can't necessarily penalize the participant for doing that, but we don't have to include those data into the data set if we have substantial reason to believe that the person was responding just randomly, or maybe even in a manner that was malicious. There are cases in which people are deliberately responding incorrectly, and when we can tell that there's a deliberate attempt to thwart the experiment, we have a right, and some people would argue an obligation, to get rid of those data, because if we were to include those data, then we would be maybe increasing the risk of a false negative or a false positive. Okay, so we want to get the science right. participants too have ethical obligations. Okay, let's move on. Here's an important point. We see all these beautiful young people here, and in this case we have very young children. These might be toddlers and so forth. Informed consent is especially important when children are involved. You can imagine just how delicate the situation is when you're dealing with young children, and it raises some interesting points because children really are not mentally prepared to offer their consent. So the typical rule is that we have to get consent from the parent or the legal guardian if we're going to be using children. There is another idea that's related to this, and that is that we have the issue of assent. Assent is not quite the same as consent. Consent is what we typically require in an experiment, and that is when we're dealing with a participant, we have to get their signature, their approval, their willingness to participate. And typically we would expect to get that from a person who is mentally competent to make that decision. If we have young children working with us, sometimes if we have other folks who are quite a bit older than these young children would be, these might be adults, for example, adults of any age, who maybe have recently been in an accident, and maybe they're mentally impaired in some way. And then we can ask the fair ethical question, was that person really in an appropriate state to be offering consent? At the very least, we hope to get assent, an expressed willingness to participate. And we try to obtain that whenever possible when we're working with children or maybe with adults who are impaired in some way and are unable to give consent themselves. In all cases, though, it's important that we do require of the researchers that consent is obtained from a party that legitimately could be offering consent. Okay, let's move on to another interesting issue, and we'll ask you to think about this potential pop quiz question. Here's a diagram of two people sitting in a public park. Okay? And it seems like a relatively innocent photo, and it looks like these folks are enjoying themselves, but we can ask what kinds of ethical issues might arise from observing this couple in the public park. Okay? I'll let you stop the video and jot down a response to that question. Okay, let's move on. Welcome back. Here we have a diagram of a very famous psychology experiment that you might remember from your introductory psychology course. This is called the Milgram Experiment. Okay? And there is an important issue that arose at that time. And of course, the Milgram Experiment was conducted many decades ago when we as a field were still developing our ideas about what it is to conduct ethical research. You might imagine that in the earliest days of psychology, there were no IRBs. There were no IACUCs. People just had a research idea and they conducted these research studies. And in many cases, there was really no harm done. But in other cases, we now look back somewhat aghast at the ethical breaches that we believe had occurred. Okay, so here's the very famous Milgram study. And the question is, what ethical issue arose in the classic Milgram study? We'll let you stop the video and see if you can address that. Okay, welcome back. Okay, we'll go on to our next issue. After a study, researchers must provide each participant with a debriefing. This is a very important component of the research process. When we're talking about research ethics, two words that are frequently used, and they're almost used in tandem, would be informed consent and debriefing. So we've talked a little bit about the importance of consent and, when possible, also assent. But consent and debriefing. Consent always has to happen before the study begins, and debriefing happens at the end. Just a note about that before we get into some of the details of debriefing. Debriefing can take at least two general forms. The most common form is that there is a full and complete debriefing immediately after the participant has completed the study. It's usually most convenient to do it that way. There's another variety on debriefing that we call a partial debriefing. And in a partial debriefing, what happens is the participant completes the study, and then immediately after completing the study, we tell the participant that they are receiving a partial debriefing. We're thanking them for their participation in the study, but we don't share with them many or even any of the details of this study. And the reason that we might choose to do that is that we have scenarios where there might be a relatively closed society or a relatively small college campus, and people begin talking one to the next. Let's say that there's a component of a particular study that involves deceit, and that deceit had been approved by the IRB, or that there is something about the study where we want the participant to be naive in some way. And you know how things are on a college campus. Friends talk with one another, classmates talk with one another, roommates and teammates talk with one another. So maybe we don't want word about the details of a particular study to get out because we want each participant to come into the study with a certain naivete. So in that particular case, it can be considered ethical to give a partial debriefing immediately after the participant is done. And then after all participants have completed the study, what we might do is contact by mail or by email or some other mechanism a complete description of the debriefing. That would entail such things as the education about what the study was about and what was motivating the study, some of the research and literature that had gone into that phenomenon before the study was conducted, some of the motivation for the study. We want to justify the use of deception. If in fact deception was used, you should tell your participant, we actually did engage in deception, and this is why, and this is the extent of the deception that we used, and you should now know that you're being debriefed about that, we might say to our participant. We might provide the participants with the chance to ask questions. If you're doing that in person, that's very easy to do. It's also a good idea to have some kind of contact information on your debriefing form, such that if at the moment the participant doesn't have a question, but later on, maybe 1 or 2 days later, or later that same day, they can get in contact by phone or by email or by some other mechanism with somebody who is responsible for the study. Typically we call that person the PI, or the primary investigator. But there can be any number of persons involved in running the study who can serve in that capacity, who can answer the questions that the participants might have. Maybe it's not a question, maybe it's a comment or even a complaint that they might have about the study. It's important that we remain open in this communication, and the debriefing is a place to do that. Also very important is that we want to express gratitude for the participants' time and effort. We should always be aware of the fact that science can't progress without participants. This is especially true in psychology. And people are busy, and they're taking time out of their busy schedules to participate in our study. We should always express gratitude. It's good manners. It's also good science. We want people to have a very positive feeling about the contributions that they've just made to the advancement of science. Okay? So it's important that we express gratitude in person and also in our written debriefing forms. Researchers also benefit by the debriefing, and we as researchers benefit in a few ways. And that might not be obvious to people. We often think of the debriefing as being a benefit that we offer to the participant. But the researchers often learn how participants viewed the experience. It might be the case that the researchers learn that the participants are particularly uncomfortable in a given room. Maybe the temperature is not right. Maybe the lighting is bad. Maybe we get comments about the study being too long, or feedback on how we interacted with the participants. We're always open to those suggestions. We want to make the studies as effective as we can and as pleasant as we can for our participants. Another idea is we sometimes receive comments that generate new studies. I know that I myself have been in receipt of some information during the debriefing session when people have said to me, when I was performing your task, I frequently could make a correct answer if I looked for this particular feature within the stimulus. And I learned sometimes that I have a confound inside of my stimulus that I didn't know, and I asked the participants to complete a particular task, and they were nominally doing that, but they also felt that they could respond correctly by doing something else. This is not a breach of ethics on their part. It just shows me that I need to be more careful about how I design my stimuli. I might not have learned about that particular feature in my stimulus had I not done the debriefing. So there are lots of benefits for us as researchers and also for our participants when we engage in debriefing. It's a critical component and required by the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. Okay. We'll go on now to a couple of other issues. We'll go on to the important ethical issue of plagiarism. And this is something that is very important when we begin to write up our scientific presentations. Or maybe we're making a presentation by way of poster. at a scientific conference or by way of an oral presentation at a science conference. And so we might ask this question, under what conditions are reference citations required? As a writer, even in your other classes, you know the importance of having appropriate citations for the items that you're referencing. So we'll give you a moment to pause and stop the video and answer this question, under what conditions are reference citations required? Okay, why don't we move on? Let's talk a little bit about citation. And what will happen here is that when you're writing your citations in a research report, there are at least two general ways in which the citations are to be listed inside the body of the text. Okay? One idea is that some journals require authors to list references alphabetically. Okay, so regardless of the chronology of the papers that you're citing, we simply list by the author's last name, whichever set of authors happens to have the first author with a letter beginning earliest in the alphabet. We put that one first and we proceed on through the alphabet. All citations are given strictly alphabetically. Another way of doing it, according to some journals, is that we list the chronology. Some people will talk about the importance of the word priority. And what they mean by priority is not necessarily that something is more important than something else is. And that's the way that you and I use the word priority in our everyday lives. Instead, you can see the root word prior here. And what they mean by prior is that something that was originally investigated in the 1920s happened before something that was investigated in the 1950s. And so if you're developing your citations in the text, they would want the 1920s reference to occur first in the 1950s. This is following priority. The other algorithm would be by going alphabetically. Okay, so different journals have different rules about that, and there might be pros and cons associated with each of those. Let's talk about some ethical issues now related to authorship. It might be the case that while you're in college, you will have the chance to participate in some research as a researcher yourself, not just as a participant, but in some level of involvement as a researcher. And then the issue becomes, should you be an author on that study? Okay? Generally, this is how we handle this issue. Science journals typically require that all people who make significant intellectual contributions to a study should be granted authorship status. Let's give you some examples about folks who might not be reaching that threshold of significant intellectual contributions. It might be, for example, that you've got somebody who is willing to look at some stimuli for you just to let you know whether the stimuli are centered or whether the stimuli are bright enough, and that might take a moment or two of your friend's time. That person helped you. Is that a significant intellectual contribution? Probably not. Okay? Let's go on to another case. Let's say that you need lots of paperwork for a particular study, and you have somebody who's an administrator in your office who helps you very diligently with creating photocopies of all those materials. Should that person who did all of that good work that supported your research be cited as an author? No, probably not, because again, that's not a significant intellectual contribution. Okay? Now there are some gray areas. Suppose you have a student working with you or some other collaborator working with you, and they make some intellectual contributions, but these are comments that are made in passing, or they're comments that occur over just a moment or two, and it's not maybe central to how the ideas were formed in the study, or what motivated the study, or how the study's data are being interpreted and so forth. Those kinds of comments probably would not warrant a significant intellectual contribution, but they might. Another alternative is that many journals allow you to say that there's an acknowledgement section, and you might say something like, this work benefited by helpful comments from researcher so-and-so, and you can name that person. So that's a way of acknowledging somebody who made some kind of contribution, but maybe not sufficiently significantly large a contribution to warrant authorship. Okay? Okay, author sequence. Sometimes that is alphabetical and sometimes that is proportional. So if you're going to be an author on your paper, one idea about how authorship is allocated, there's often a first author, a second author, third and fourth authors, and so forth. Who gets to be first author? In some fields of science, to be first author is considered an honor, and it's supposed to indicate that that person was the primary intellectual contributor. Okay? That's how some fields work. Other fields will go simply alphabetically. So in those fields, it's a little bit difficult to know who contributed what and how much of a contribution each person had made. A few of the current journals have people actually stipulate who did the writing, who did the data collection, and things along these lines. But these are two different ways of thinking about this. I wonder if I can offer you one informal comment about the author sequence issue. There are sometimes individual differences in style here. If you go on to psychology graduate school, you might find that you are in some laboratories where the primary investigator, the professor for whom you are working, has some strict rules about authorship sequence. And there are some PIs, primary investigators, who always want to be first author on anything that comes out of their laboratory. They're always first author, and that's just the rule. That's the rule they have. There are other PIs who go the other way. They put themselves last. And on many scientific papers, when you see a person in the last position, and if that person is a particularly well-known researcher, it usually means that they were overseeing the entire process and that this happened in their laboratory. And the other authors are typically more junior, with the first author being the junior author who provided the most input on that particular study. So the author sequence is actually quite interesting. And I think you'll develop some feel for this as we see some examples throughout the semester. Okay. I'll be interested in getting your ideas on the ethical pros and cons of animal research in psychology. And there are surely pros and cons. It's not quite so cut and dried. Here I have listed some pictures that reflect some animals that are typically used by psychologists and also by neuroscientists. Here are two invertebrates. This is Aplysia californica, sometimes simply called a sea slug. We sometimes do experiments, very interesting learning experiments in honeybees. Then sometimes we make our way out of the domain of invertebrates over to vertebrates like birds or rats. Pigeons and rats are almost canonical animals used in psychological research. Occasionally we'll use cats. There's been quite a bit of work done in recording from the cat visual cortex as well as the macaque-monkey visual cortex. So here we have now some mammals. Here we have a mammal that's also a primate, the macaque-monkey. And then we go all the way up to apes. We have a chimpanzee over on this side. Okay, so we have a pretty good range of animals from diverse portions of the animal kingdom. And the question to you is about your ideas regarding the ethical pros and cons associated with animal research in psychology. We'll give you a moment to stop the video and proceed from there. Okay. So we're all done, and what I'd like you to do now is look over the notes that you've taken and see if you can jot down two things as always. It's very important that you jot down something that you thought was particularly interesting, something that you didn't know before you watched this video and that you learned anew, okay? And also something that you found to be a little bit unclear. Maybe there was a gray area for you or something you just didn't understand when you were going through this video, and bring those comments into class and we'll have a really great class discussion. See you in class.